Different cities in different countries? No, both are Cairo. One screen showing what's happening in Liberation Square, the other what state TV wants people to think the Egyptian capital is really like. Who's getting the real picture? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme with me, David Foster. Events in Egypt are top of the news agenda in many countries across the world. And how is that news being handled? Well, very differently, we can see, depending on where you stand. If you're Egypt's government, it's crisis. What crisis? Lovely pictures of a sunbathed Nile and not a placard in sight. Contrast that with 24-hour coverage of demonstrators, security forces, tanks, and the obvious tensions. Joining us now in Doha, Joe Khalil, an assistant professor of communication at Northwestern University and co-author of the book Arab Television Industries. In London, the Egyptian journalist Osama Diab. And joining us on the phone from Cairo, Hassan Hamid, Dean of the Faculty of Mass Communications at MSA University and former head of the Egyptian State Broadcasting Corporation's Board of Trustees. Well, Egypt has always been a major regional media player. Its press is one of the most influential and widely read across the region, and it has one of the oldest and biggest domestic state broadcasting corporations with 8 terrestrial channels. There are more than 500 newspapers, and most of them are independent. But the government owns controlling shares in the 3 main daily newspapers. Al-Aram, with a daily circulation of around 1 million copies. Al-Akhbar, circulation there maybe 750,000. And Al-Gomhuriyya, the smallest, around about 70,000. The editor-in-chief of these dailies appointed by the president and the employees chosen by members of the ruling party. Well, despite the fact that all the 24 opposition parties in Egypt have the right to publish their own newspapers, only 14 of them do so. Let's bring in Hassan Hamid. Used to be in charge of TV and radio, state TV and radio in Egypt between 2001 and 2004. So not so very long ago, Mr. Hamid. Is state television, is state radio, the newspaper, simply a propaganda arm of the Mubarak regime?
Well, they are not supposed to be like that, simply because, you know, the Egyptian Radio and Television Broadcasting Corporation, it is modeled after the BBC, and its board of trustees is the supreme governing body, and it should be having its distance from the government.
But did you, when you were in charge, feel that was really the case?
Well, it was the case in most cases. In most instances. But whenever there is a crisis, all that would crumble. Luckily enough, at my time, we never went through any crisis.
But there would be those people who suggest that just by broadcasting the banalities of a regime and daily news as controlled by the government, that meant that the crisis which was underneath it all just didn't get shown on television.
Yeah, you know, when the crisis is as such, I can, you know, put myself into the place of people in charge there, and I really pity them, simply because the situation is much more larger than they would have ever anticipated. Nobody could have anticipated that the Egyptians, especially the young men and women, would go out in the streets in millions, you know, to ask the regime to step down and to go away.
Let's bring in Joe Khalil at this point. Mr. Hamid there suggests that in quieter times, the state broadcast and television and newspapers simply portray a picture of calm throughout Egypt, which is or is not legitimate depending on where you come from. But right now, what do you see the state-controlled media doing?
Well, it's really interesting that it remained trying to do the same thing all the way up until Friday. Friday was a sort of a game changer in the way they were broadcasting and the kind of message that they were trying to relay. Up until Friday, they were kind of dismissive of what's going on, something that they've treated previous types of smaller uprising by dismissing them, borderline ignoring them. The game changer was on Friday when almost the protesters were knocking on their doors, where they had to change. And the kind of narrative that started playing out is the kind of narrative where peaceful people, peace-loving people stay at home and thugs run the streets. And this is the kind of narrative that all 8 channels plus the satellite channels that are part of the state apparatus are sort of trying to put across.
Do you feel the people who work at these organizations truly believe in what they're doing, or are they controlled by a very strong government?
It really doesn't matter at this stage whether they believe or not. It's very few, like the case of Mahmoud Saad, a prominent talk show host, decided that they don't want to toe the line, but others are easily replaceable.
Let's
and
talk about. Sorry
someone
about
like
that.
him is replaceable.
Yeah, I was just going to bring in some of the newspapers. Headlines from earlier on this week in the 2 main state-controlled newspapers. This one is Al-Akhbar, the other one Al-Ahram. Al-Akhbar's headlines yesterday were new cabinet headed by Ahmed Shafiq formed, rectifying people's demands, people happy with the return of security to the streets. And if we take a look at Al-Ahram, headline is saying President meets military commanders, demonstrators call for reforms and reject anarchy, and it talks about the previous, as we now know, Interior Minister inspecting security forces. Let me bring in Osama Diab in London here. When you take a look at the Egyptian newspapers, if you're an ordinary Egyptian citizen, if there can be such a thing, are you able to make an informed choice about what is news and what is simply what the authorities want you to hear?
Well, the thing is that, like for long, like state-run media has always been a propaganda arm of the Egyptian regime during calm and during crisis. Like a headline, like the first page is always about NDP achievements, like Mubarak's achievements, like Mubarak opening a factory, and they never voiced. There was never place for like voices from other opposition groups in state-run media, whether this is television or newspaper or print media. And yeah, and people just lost faith in state-run media. And like
I wonder why they
now
lost faith when for so many years it had been what they'd been spoon-fed day after day.
Yeah, because this is the thing, like talk about reform. Egyptians now do not want reform. What they want is change. That's the thing. And because state-run media, being a propaganda arm of the regime, has promised reform for 3 decades. 30 years Egyptians have been promised reforms and nothing happened. So people are just frustrated, fed up, angry at the regime and all the state-run media. So yeah, I mean, like why would they believe them now?
Let's bring in Hassan Hamid once again, because fascinating for me to be able to talk to you since you were there in charge of state-run television and radio in Egypt between 2001 and 2004. What do you make now of the multitude of opportunities people have with satellite television, social networking, the internet, all the channels that are coming in, all the information that's coming in compared to what was there 10 years ago?
Well, I was lucky enough, to be one factor or one of the participants in the openness of Egypt to the outside world. I was in charge when we introduced many new channels known by the name of Nile TV. So Nile TV International and the rest of the Nile channels were part of my endeavor to improve on the local media. Especially, I have worked so many years with international organizations like NHK in Japan and Voice of America in Washington, D.C.
And were you allowed to be free and fair as you seem to suggest you wanted to be, or was there an element of control?
Well, there was the tendency at that time in order to improve on the local media and to catch up with the whole world. And so that's why we, the Ministry of Information at that time, allowed the Egyptians, to own dishes and to hook up with the rest of the world in the new millennia. As a matter of fact, there was, this tendency to improve in all scores of life. And at that time, we were feeling that there was a democratic, improvement and a democratic change is happening in the regime. And we were so enthusiastic about it. And it went on to 2005, even after I left my position in the Broadcasting Corporation.
In what way did you see change taking place?
There was the hope of democracy. The constitution was changed, and it allowed for the presidency to be competed in the elections for the first time in Egypt history. And so the things were promising, Democracy was in the process of improvement. And out of a sudden, when we reached 2010, everything was, upside down. Everything was reversed to the opposite. And instead of having a better parliament for 2010, better than the one that we had in 2005, we have seen that how the elections resulted in the deprivation of all opposition and the takeover from Ahmed Izz and his...
Let me ask you how those elections were portrayed throughout the state-run Egyptian media.
Well, the state-run Egyptian media, of course, was totally under the government's, rule, and they were carrying only one point of view. That was the government's point of view, which was not convincing to anybody, especially that all the free newspapers were saying something else. Something totally different, and in spite of all the trials of the Ministry of Information to, force the other private sector television stations to tell a different story than the ones they were telling the people.
Well, can I just bring back in Joe Khalil at this point, Mr. Hamid, and ask him, when we're talking about the private stations, whether in fact they were able to say anything they wanted when it came to the elections, or whether there was still somebody sitting on them?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We bring up the term democracy. When these channels were given their licenses, the licenses were given to businessmen who were part of the NDP, part of the ruling party, and/or proxies of the ruling party. There were businessmen with certain types of political affiliations, which even by law, they were prevented from doing political programming. They tried to bypass that simply to gain a certain level of popularity and to distinguish themselves from the state television by doing the kind of talk shows bordering in criticism of corruption in the government, but definitely not attacking the regime itself.
So was this effectively sort of a means of being able to say, listen, we are trying to be free and fair, when in fact it was just a cosmetic change which allowed them to go so far, but not over a certain line when it comes to criticism?
Oh, definitely. One can list several instances, including ones during the election of 2005, when these television stations were intimidated to broadcast the president's visits and tours and campaigning, or even to not allow the opposition to have a platform.
Well, let's listen to what some people who've spoken to Al Jazeera have had to say about press freedom, if you like, in their country, because it was Friday, you may remember, when Egyptian authorities shut down the broadcasting of Al Jazeera Mubashir. That's our live channel, and it receives phone calls from audiences. Yet those same people who would have tried to get in and watch the programme still continued to call in, even though they couldn't see it in their country. And this is a little sample of what they had to say about state-run television.
I want to thank Al Jazeera for broadcasting real pictures on the screen. The Egyptian state channels 1 and 2 are not showing anything. They're showing life is beautiful and no problems.
I congratulate Egyptian TV and their satellite channels for their fall and the failure of their presenters, both male and female, and their reporters, who are playing mental games with the Egyptian people. Egyptians are smarter than you think. You cannot fool them, broadcasting useless material.
Unfortunately, I watch the Egyptian channels. I see a group of hypocrites. They create their own idol and then worship him. Those are the ones who got us to where we are now. They live in a different world, in a planet of their own.
Well, that's just a little bit of what was on Al Jazeera's Mubashir channel. Let's go to London once again. Osama Diab is there for us. If people are getting their information from channels such as the Al Jazeera network and other satellite stations, do they believe anything they see on state-run television anymore?
No, like as I said before, they don't believe anything. And I don't know what reforms Mr. Hamid was talking about, but the thing is, all the reforms were just cosmetic. Like now, like state-run media looks fancier and glitzier, but the message is the same. Like they're pumping so much money into investing in the state-run media to rival and compete with channels such as Al Jazeera, to be able to convey the same message they had before to the public, but like the content is the same, and so I wouldn't really call this reform. I would call it, like, I don't know, refurbishment, like renovation, but I would never call it reform.
Well, do you think the other TV outlets and radio outlets, such as ourselves, and there are others, of course, are playing a positive part in what we're seeing on the streets of Egypt, or not?
Yes, I think that like part of this revolution is having like other alternative media, because like for so long all we had was Channel 1 and 2 and like a few like three major newspapers, state-run newspapers. But now that we have like now with the introduction of satellite TV and like internet outlets such as Facebook and like social networking websites.
But are people playing up to the cameras? Because I've noticed a number of signs in English. Now, you wouldn't expect people in Cairo necessarily to be broadcasting their thoughts in English unless they knew it would be understood by an English audience. Perhaps the viewers of Al Jazeera English.
Exactly, people feel, and the reason why they have English signs is that they feel that the message is being delivered to the entire world. And they know the entire world is watching through the internet, through satellite TV, like through Al Jazeera. So they now they know they can influence the international community, and like the U.S. foreign policy, for example. And they know that their voices is being heard due to like channels like Al Jazeera or like Facebook or like the internet. So this is definitely giving them confidence, empowering them. And yeah, this is the reason why we see so many English signs in the protests.
Joe Khalil, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment. That's after I talked to Mr. Hamid Hassan Hamid in Cairo once again. Worth pointing out, sir, that you were at one stage until, 7 years ago, in charge of Egyptian state-run television and radio. When it comes to the presence of news channels such as ourselves, and we aren't the only one there, but we're getting a lot of press about it, do you think there's any sense of incitement by the presence of TV cameras?
Well, I'd like just to comment on what has been said, if you allow me. I disagree with what has been said, that all was cosmetics and things like that. The Egyptian television, especially the private sector television, was not owned by proxy people for the regime. It was not. And the talk shows that were running, even in the state-owned television, Beit Beitek and other programs were enjoying a lot of freedom, and they were enjoying, their presenters were enjoying giving their opinions and having all matters to be commented upon.
I'm going to stop you for just a second. I will come back in a moment. But Joe Khalil, you wanted to respond to that point.
I mean, that's why Beit Beitek was cancelled, scrapped off the airwaves. And that's why
all the way through. Now you are interrupting me.
I'm sorry. I'm just
I did ask him to comment, Mr. Hamid. Then we'll come back to you. Sorry, Mr. Khalil, what were you saying?
No, I'm just rectifying the fact that you can't trumpet a show like Al Bayt Baytak, which was cancelled simply because it was crossing specific lines. The same with Mona Al-Shadhili, who decided last Wednesday to stop going on air.
Baytak was changing name only. The title was changed.
I'm sorry, sir. It changed the company. It was no longer.
Can we get back to the broader picture? Mr. Hamid, if I could ask you this question once again. Do you think the presence of TV news cameras from 24-hour channels such as ourselves and the fact that we see placards in English is an incitement to trouble, or is it simply an indication of the freedom of the media in other countries?
As a professional, I am a journalist, and I am for freedom 100%, and I am for the cameras to carry whatever it carries, as long as it is abiding by the ethics of the photo as we know it as professionals. Other than that, I disagree with it.
Do you think it possibly makes a difficult situation worse, the presence of the cameras?
Well, personally, no. Of course, I do not. Definitely not.
Okay. Joe Khalil?
Oh, of course. I mean, the media can play a role in terms of incitement. We've seen this. We've seen this definitely in places like Iraq with specific terms and so on and so forth. But I think what is interesting in this particular case and what's unfolding here and what unfolded a couple of weeks ago in Tunisia is how alternative media is merging along with mainstream media, and how alternative media, and by this I mean the two types. One, what we're referring to as emerging media, the kind of internet, Facebook, social media aspects, and also the performative aspects of media. People gathering around on the streets with banners and waving signs and so on and so forth. How both emerging media and performative acts are using mainstream media as a platform to relay their messages to the outside world. And this is not something that's new or unique. This is something that time and time again, social movements like the one we're seeing have used in previous histories, both in the Arab world and outside. Tiananmen Square is only happened, 30 years ago? Or 20 years ago, and what happened in Beirut in 2005. It's these performative acts, I think, that are using mainstream media to actually relay their messages to the outside world.
Osama Diab, you're a journalist now, I think, for 3 years. You operate on a different level generationally to a lot of us in the profession. When you go out looking for news, do you stick with a channel of choice, or do you surf these days?
No, I mean, like I definitely surf around and rely on a variety of sources, and definitely like social networking websites are very important. But the thing is that they've been cut out from Egypt. Like Egypt had no internet during the past week because the government is so afraid. And the thing is, like, a government that fears the media is a very unstable government. And Al Jazeera, for example, has for long been accused of trying to destabilize Egypt, and like a regime that is that could be destabilized by a media report or an article is already a very unstable regime.
A quick final thought. In this day and age, therefore, is state-run television and broadcasting as an arm of the government simply outdated? Yeah, exactly. And like surprisingly, even though the regime is collapsing now, they are still trying to, like if you watch the Egyptian television now, the state-run TV, like you only see images of destruction and vandalism and chaos to convey a message that the only choice the Egyptian people have is between the Mubarak regime and chaos. Well, I have to say there are a great many other outlets from which they can get their information, including this one, including Inside Story. So I'd like to thank you all for taking part in this discussion. In Doha, Joe Khalil.
Thank you.
In London, Osama Diab, and also in Cairo on the phone, Hassan Hamid, former head of Egyptian State Radio and Television. To all three of you, thank you very much indeed for taking part in our program, and to those of you who've watched, thank you as well. Send us your suggestions, email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Until next time, goodbye.